Back here on One, New York's longest running sports call-in show. I am Andrew Posadas alongside Sam Davis. It is now our pleasure to welcome our next guest. He is the coordinating producer for original programming at MLB Network and the director of MLB's official 2020 World Series film, narrated by Fordham's own Vin Scully, his sixth straight season directing the official World Series film, Jed Tuminaro. Jed, a pleasure to have you here on the program.
Thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it.
I hope all is well with you and your family amid the pandemic right now. And Jed, I kind of wanted to get into this year's World Series. Obviously, we had a shortened season, a postseason bubble up until the World Series, then it being played at a neutral site. Obviously, there were some challenges due to the limited on-site crew and the fact that you weren't able to get in-depth interviews in the locker room with players. Can you kind of just talk about these challenges that you had filming this year's World Series film?
Yeah, I mean, we had, as you mentioned, just because of everything going on, we had, some less resources than we normally have, less camera crews, less producers, but still really good people on site. And even though we had some restrictions and plenty of protocols to follow and some less people, I think in the end, when you watch the film, it hopefully doesn't show. I think we were still able to get what we needed to get and just found different ways to do it. We still were able to do interviews with players. We still were able to cover things like press conferences. And, in a strange way, as much as we had so many limitations and most things you would perceive would be negative, it wasn't. In a way, there were some positives. And what I mean by that is there was so much less media there this year, but yet we were still there. So we were able to cover certain things in a more intimate way, maybe than we were able to do it. If Clayton Kershaw was giving a press conference, let's say, typically he's behind the mic and there's 120 reporters in that room. We were the only people in that room, which was nice. So even though we weren't necessarily capturing audio that everyone else didn't hear because all the networks got the feeds of that, we still were the only people in there able to get some nice, intimate, up-close shots of that. And in that respect, we sort of found some silver linings.
Jed, once again, great to have you here. As my partner Andrew mentioned, Vin Scully, I mean, he's very dear to our hearts here at Fordham. He's a Fordham graduate. He's dear to all the hearts of Dodgers fans. Can you just talk about how cool was it to work with someone as iconic as he is?
It was great. It was great because, first of all, he's the best, and he's still, if not one of, he's the best at what he's done. But also, it's such a unique perspective to have that type of longevity in that you can actually have someone narrate the Dodgers championship film in 2020, and yet he's been there for all of them. He's been there from Brooklyn through the championships in the 60s, through the 80s, and still doing it and still at the top of his craft. So it was really cool because to have that happen, you need someone to be as great as he is, but also have that type of longevity. And to have that combo is, pretty rare, if at all. So I thought it was a fitting touch to have him be the soundtrack for this latest championship for that franchise.
And Jed, up until, the World Series actually started, a lot of people thought there weren't going to be fans. Ultimately, the decision was made to allow limited fans in the stands. Do you think the dynamic of the film would have changed had there been no fans throughout the 6 games of the World Series?
Probably a little bit, because even though there was so many limited fans there, they're still there. And when they're there, they're passionate. And you could still get shots of that. You could still document that. So, yeah, I think so. I think even, if there was no one, I don't think it would change so much when the actual game is starting because we're covering most of the action that's unfolding. But I do think it changes a little bit, especially with some of the crews. One crew that we have is what we call kind of like a roaming crew. They're kind of getting game action shots, but they're not really solely responsible for those shots. They're responsible for getting fans and shooting different types of shots that are going on in and around the stadium. So even though there was limited participation there, we were still able to cover that. If there was nothing going on there, I think it would have changed how we approached the game a little bit.
With any World Series, there's certainly ups and downs, even in such an exciting one as we found in 2020. I mean, how do you handle some of the most dramatic moments like Game 4? Obviously, everyone remembers such an awesome finish there, along with some of the more ordinary games or maybe even blowouts throughout the series. How do you handle those ups and downs in a film?
Yeah,
like this?
That's a great question, especially, when you're covering the game, your mindset doesn't change that much because you really don't know what's going to unfold. I mean, you kind of sense it a little bit. This game's moving slower. It maybe isn't as dramatic. And where you have a moment like game 4, you could sort of brace for it. You might see it coming. But I think a lot of that, to what you're, mentioned, is how we handle it more in post-production. We know that the film sort of has a rough target runtime, and it's not all equal. We won't treat a 4-1 game that doesn't have any drama the same way we're going to treat that game 4. So, a lot of times the sound bites we try to get, the way we cover our press conferences, the way we treat it in an edit room, will depend on the severity and the drama of the game. And even in a year like this, like where the Dodgers won, probably the most exciting and memorable game was a game they didn't win, but you still don't want to shortchange it. We know it's kind of a Dodgers film. It's almost exclusively for their audience, but you don't want to just gloss over a game like that because of the ramifications, and really was one of the all-time greats.
Here talking with producer and director Jed Tuminaro. Jed, obviously, as I mentioned at the top of this interview, this is your 6th straight World Series film. And I think for most directors, you kind of have that one part that might be your favorite or something that resonates with you the most. What was that one thing in this year's World Series that resonated with you the most?
I think for this year, for me, and I think, we had mentioned it, you had mentioned it a few minutes ago, where like 60-game season, I think when, for me, it was, you don't go into a season, you go in wondering who's going to be in the World Series. Where's the World Series going to be? What teams are going to be? You don't go into a season saying, is there going to be a World Series? And in that respect, it was really like, it was a fragile season. You didn't know if there would be a season. You didn't know if there would be a World Series. And then when they announced the framework for the season, I was ecstatic that there was going to be a World Series. But I think from a personal standpoint, I didn't know, like, was it going to feel the same? Was it going to feel the same as a regular year, the regular season? And for me, I think the most satisfying thing, and what I'll take from it, is seeing what it meant to the players that were in that series. And when you see the emotion, whether it's a game 4, like we were just talking about, or how the Dodgers, their reactions after the series was over, like, chasing that championship for so long, especially these last few years. If there were any questions that at least I had, like, was it the same? Was it going to count as much? To me, those were laid to rest, like it did. So I think the emotion and knowing what it took to get a season in and finish a World Series, in some ways, like, I don't know, like maybe to some players, I can't speak for them, but it almost might have meant even more perhaps than past ones.
So Jed, I mean, like Andrew just said, you've worked on these films since 2015. What would you say is the biggest thing that you've learned over those years of experience for your own professional career?
I think the combination of, when you do what we do to cover this, preparing and, as much as you could prepare and have a plan laid out, and you should, and, whether it's, how you're going to cover something, things you're going to tackle editorially, just the ability to adjust. And this year showed us that. So you still want to go in there with an idea of what you want to do and what you want to cover and how you want to put it together. But then as it unfolds, you just want to make sure that you have the ability to be flexible, to adjust to certain things. And that's what I've learned, is it's great to have a game plan, and you absolutely should, but you have to be willing to deviate from that game plan day to day, sometimes even hour to hour, with what you're going to cover and what you're going to do. And that's one thing this year with some limited resources, without getting too much in the weeds. In the past, we don't really have to choose a lot about what we're going to cover. We choose a lot about how we're going to put it together, but we have plenty of crews, plenty of people. We could be in a lot of places at once. This year was a little different because we had less cameras, less producers. There was a lot more adjusting to where do we need to be. We said we wanted to be here, but guess what? This happened. Now we have to move over here and change it a little bit. So I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned, is prepare as much as you should, because you definitely should as a producer director, but also have the ability to adjust and, go with the flow.
Now, Jed, you've been with the MLB Network since 2008. You get the opportunity to start directing World Series films in 2015. So you put in 7 years. Can you kind of just take us back to 2015 and when you first got the opportunity, or when you first got the call that they wanted you to direct the World Series film?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I had a little bit of a head start because I'm at MLB Network, as you mentioned, since 2008. I used to work at a company, MLB Productions, which is a lot of the same people now work with us at the network. So I was part of the World Series film years ago, more as an editor. back in the studio putting games together. So I wasn't there on site. I wasn't directing the cameras and the crews or conducting the interviews, but I still got to see what it was like to kind of put it together a little bit, which helped. And then in 2015, which was the Royals Mets year, it was a lot. It was the first time kind of just, being there and having all the crews under your umbrella and having to kind of manage your time and, your resources and stuff. And it was exciting, definitely challenging. But one thing about our team, and a lot of it is consistent, we have really good shooters, really good field producers. And those guys had been doing it actually before I even came on board. I was really lucky. So when we started in the Royals Mets year in 2015, a couple of our lead field producers had been doing that role for the previous few World Series. So it really helped the transition.
And Jed, I know this is going to be tough for you to answer because you've obviously had a lot of experience here in the World Series, but could you think of any specific, whether it be a game moment or something off the field as well, that you remember that you think is your favorite from 2015 until now in the World Series?
Wow, that's a really good question. I mean, you have to it's a really good question because there's been a lot. There's been a lot of those wow moments. I mean, I think being in Cleveland for Game 7, the year the Cubs won the World Series, was certainly exciting, especially the way that game unfolded. It was probably that game because for about 80% of the game, you were sort of bracing for a Cubs win. And then all of a sudden, within a span of about 5 or 6 plays, you were like, oh my God, this is going to be an Indians win. And then you quickly went back to, then there was this rain delay. I think that was probably the most exciting and dramatic night that I can remember. But there's been a lot of really good ones. I mean, I remember even the ones that don't look like the Royals Mets. I think that was a 5-game series, but it was deceiving because there were some really close games in that series, including the clincher. But if one had to stand out, I think just because of everything that went into it, it was the Game 7 in 2016.
Jed, I want to talk to you about 2017 and the Houston Astros. Obviously, you did the film back then 3 years later. Now, with the scandal involving A.J. Hinch and Alex Cora, Carlos Beltran, and the sign stealing, when you think about it 3 years later, do you kind of go back to any of the raw footage and see if maybe there were signs that you didn't see back then? What are your thoughts 3 years later, looking back at the Houston Astros championship in 2017?
I mean, it's funny because that was a great series. As you're living it and watching it unfold, it's like I think we went back and forth about 4 different times between who we thought which team was gonna win that series. I haven't personally. I know people have. I've read articles and by really good baseball writers that broke down how many how many off-speed pitches were swung at or who wasn't taking certain pitches. But that wasn't necessarily our footage. That was probably more game footage. So not really, because when you're there doing what we do, it's never entering. You're just watching really good competition. That it was nothing at the time that looked like, oh my God, something's great. It was just really 2 good teams loaded with star players kind of going back and forth. I'm sure if people really did some hardcore breakdowns, which I'm sure they have, maybe there are, but not from my standpoint. I just remember kind of going back and forth in that series like, this is an incredible series unfolding. I know that's not a great glamorous answer, but that's kind of what it felt like at the time. So,
like you said, Jed, in 2020, you guys certainly faced a lot of challenges with the COVID-19 pandemic, as you said. Less shooters and filmers on site. Do you expect these problems to be around in the 2021 World Series? I know this is not really for certain, and we don't know. But what do you think is going to be the filming process next season?
I hope not. It's funny. I mean, I don't know really anything more than anyone, but as much as I look back on this one, and it's like I'm really proud that this group was able to do it. Not me. The people that work on this are just incredible, and it made me feel really good that it all kind of came together. But there is a part of me that's like, I hope that was a once in a generational type thing, not because we need more resources, none of that, just because of the bigger picture and what it would mean. So I don't know. I mean, it does show you that you could kind of do certain things differently than you thought. You're forced to execute a certain way. And in that respect, one thing about that this year showed us a little bit, and that I hope we're not obviously in this boat next year, but there were certain things we did in this film that we did sort of out of necessity, but that I like, that I kind of want to run with. And part of that was the press conferences. Sometimes we rely a lot more on sit-down interviews, which are still really good. But this year, because we didn't know how that was going to work and were we going to have as much access to the players, we kind of did a lot more things like covering press conferences and things like that. And I thought it was good. I thought it showed it was a pretty good edit device in the film, and it looks a little more behind the scenes, just a little more accessy. And so there were things like that. But as far as what we're going to be like in a year from now, who knows? But I hope not.
Are there any improvements that you can think of off the top of your head from what you guys did this past year to next year if the pandemic should still be around?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I'd have to think about it. I'm sure there always are, there definitely could be improvements. I think in some ways, I think maybe figuring out one thing we couldn't do this year, which we've done in the past, was we've always had some really good access elements away from the field. And we've been lucky enough to be in players' houses the day of games, the night before games, going to ride to ballparks with players. That's always been a pretty cool staple of the film. We usually have something like that almost every year. This year we couldn't, for good reason, because everything kind of began at the ballpark, so we didn't really have the access to do those types of things. And hopefully we're not doing this next year and this type of thing. But if we are, we might be able to have more preparation and lead time for it. So there's ways to figure out, how can we get an access element? What can we do? This year, it kind of came fast. We were all following this for the first time. So it was something that really we knew wasn't going to happen. So that might be an improvement, figuring out a way to still incorporate some access, maybe a way to do more with fans if there still is. And again, hopefully not, but limited fans at the games. There might be a way that we can kind of incorporate them a little more. We'll have to go back and look at it. But yeah, there's always, in pandemic, non-pandemic, things you could improve.
He is the coordinating producer for original programming at MLB Network. He is the director of Major League Baseball's official 2020 World Series film, which was released on Blu-ray, DVD, and digital platforms earlier this week. Jed Tuminaro. Jed, appreciate the time. Thanks for joining One-on-One.
Thank you, guys. You're great. So I appreciate it, and have a great holiday.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, guys.